This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Ecuador's young president, Daniel Noboa, is engaged in a tough battle with organized crime groups that paralyzed his country earlier this year. On today's episode, we'll do an overview of how that fight is going, Noboa's reputation at home and abroad, and a look at Ecuador's economy as well.
President Bukele had to mainly deal with what I see as street gangs that were not necessarily connected to major international drug cartels. And in a country that was not necessarily a major player in the cocaine trade. That is not the case of Ecuador. Ecuador has become a major player in the cocaine business, with Ecuadorian ports accounting for 60% of the cocaine exported to Europe, for example, according to some estimates. And criminal organizations in Ecuador are, in that sense, far more sophisticated, have more resources, and are very well connected to some of the largest cocaine cartels in the world.
Imagine you've been in politics for only about 2 years, and you are somewhat unexpectedly elected president of the country with the most severely deteriorating security situation in Latin America. A couple of months later, criminal organizations launch an unprecedented wave of attacks on institutions, including an invasion of a television station by gunmen and a mass hostage-taking of prison guards in images that make their way all over the world. That's what Ecuador's president, Daniel Noboa, has faced since coming into office in November of last year. It's been 6 months since that dramatic gang revolt back in January. Everybody said back then it was important for the whole hemisphere for Ecuador to succeed, given how many countries are facing these challenges with organized crime groups right now. We wanted to know what has happened since. How successfully has the Noboa government dealt with this security crisis? How valid are comparisons between Ecuador's crackdown and that of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador? What has happened to Noboa's popularity after it spiked as high as 70% following those attacks back in January? And is Noboa still considered the favorite to be reelected in Ecuador's next presidential elections, scheduled for February of next year? We've invited a great guest to guide us through all these questions. Sebastián Hurtado is a regular on the AQ podcast and runs a political risk consultancy based in Quito. Sebastián, welcome back to the AQ podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
Sebastián, as I mentioned in the introduction, Ecuador really grabbed the world's attention back in January with these frightening images. I think most of our listeners know the story of how the country rallied around this young president, Daniel Noboa. What has happened in the 6 months since? I mean, how has the security situation changed, if at all, and how are Ecuadorians feeling about their president?
Well, Brian, a lot has happened this year. You know, President Noboa's election was sort of a surprise last year, and we didn't know much of what to expect from his administration. But the whole country was expecting for a new government to tackle the massive crime wave. This push from Noboa against these criminal organizations, or this war against criminal organizations, generated a lot of public support for President Noboa and his government, and brought his support levels to the high 70s. However, a lot has happened since that, and that support has declined somehow. You know, at the end of June, support for President Noboa has somehow slipped and stands at just above 50%, coming down from above 70%. But still, those numbers are similar to what he had when he was elected president back in October.
And they're not bad numbers in a regional context. Around 50% is about where Lula is in Brazil. It's about where Milei is in Argentina. So it sounds like he's doing okay. But what are people saying about him now? Are there people who have turned against him, who have lost patience with the security crackdown, or was this just inevitable after the kind of maybe patriotic or rally around the flag effect of what the criminals did back in January?
I think the decline in his support from this peak of 70% have to do with a few developments in the last few months. First, I think his security strategy has been less impactful than anticipated. And we can go into the details of that later on. The second reason is that in the last few months, he has implemented a very necessary but very unpopular tax hikes that came into effect in April. And at the same time, he implemented a reduction in gasoline subsidies that took place in June. And they've all have been unpopular and has impacted support for President Noboa. At the same time, back in April, Ecuador started facing widespread energy blackouts. And even though they were not necessarily this government's fault, most people place the blame directly on a lack of preparation on the part of the government, because somehow these potential blackouts or energy blackouts were expected. And the other reason is that, after a number of months of little political conflict and somehow a constructive collaboration between Noboa and opposition in Congress, most recently he has managed to enter into direct confrontation with most political forces inside and outside Congress. This started with the arrest of former Correísta Vice President Jorge Glass. You remember that at the Mexican embassy in April?
Just to remind those who are listening, Jorge Glass was vice president during the Correa and Lenin Moreno administrations. He was forced from office and sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of receiving millions of dollars in bribes. He sought refuge in Mexico's embassy in Quito, but earlier this year, Ecuadorian police officers arrested Glass, something which Mexico described as a violation of its sovereignty.
And that has been followed by a number of significant, I would say, verbal attacks and even criminal accusations against opposition figures. And finally, all this is taking place in the context of a dismal economy. According to the IMF, the Ecuadorian economy is projected to have the worst rate of growth of any Latin American country in 2024.
I'd like to talk, Sebastián, about the security situation. Trying to understand what's happening here has been difficult, in part because the statistics have been inconsistent. Do you have any sense of what the best statistic here is? And can you talk a little bit, just as an Ecuadorian yourself, how the streets feel after, 6 months after these terrible scenes that we saw?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you. The information on crime statistics haven't been flowing as we all have expected. And the government has been very slow in releasing consolidated crime data. And as of today, the information we have has a 2-month delay. But I can tell you a couple of things with the information we have. We can see that after initial gains in reducing violent deaths, I think mostly thanks to a strong military and police presence on the street, not necessarily thanks to a very consistent crime fighting strategy, I think the overall results have been mixed. I think the government strategy has so far been very successful at controlling the situation in the prison system. Until early this year, a significant portion of the violent deaths happened within the prison system in Ecuador during riots that confronted rival gangs within the prisons. And no such events have taken place since the security forces intervened and took control of key prison facilities around the country. I think that sole effort has been very instrumental in reducing murder statistics in cities like Guayaquil and Esmeraldas, for example, which were one of the two most violent cities in 2023, and which have seen a 37% to 60% reduction in murder rates from January to April this year, as compared to the same period last year. That is according to government figures that we have at hand. But in cities like Duran, for example, homicides have tripled in the same period. Also in Manta, for example, homicides have increased by 60% in the same period. At the national level, the overall reduction in homicides this year sits at around 18%. I think that's only a marginal overall improvement considering we started at an all-time high levels of violence in 2023. But anyway, I think most people see this as an improvement anyway. And I think most people are still ready to keep supporting Noboa's war on crime. And I would say that's the local perception at the national level. The perception at specific cities where the situation has deteriorated this year, not improved, I think could be different. But still, I think most people are giving the Noboa administration the benefit of the doubt in terms of his efforts against crime.
When President Noboa announced this crackdown back in January, and when he used the word war to describe what he was going to do, many of us, maybe everyone, had the same thought, which is, here we go, there's going to be another Bukele-style crackdown in the region. Since then, there have been some reports, including from civil society organizations like Human Rights Watch, documenting violations, including at least one apparent extrajudicial killing, multiple cases of arbitrary arrests and ill treatment. At the same time, though, Sebastián, I keep hearing from people since January, really, that what Noboa is doing is quite different. And President Noboa himself has been careful to draw some differences between his strategy and what Bukele has done in El Salvador. How do you see it? I mean, what are the similarities and what are the differences?
Well, I see a couple of key differences in the situation in Ecuador and the situation in El Salvador. I think a key difference is that, President Bukele had to mainly deal with what I see as street gangs that were not necessarily connected to major international drug cartels. And in a country that was not necessarily a major player in the cocaine trade. That is not the case of Ecuador. Ecuador has become a major player in the cocaine business, with Ecuadorian ports accounting for 60% of the cocaine exported to Europe, for example, according to some estimates. And criminal organizations in Ecuador are, in that sense, far more sophisticated, have more resources, and are very well connected to some of the largest cocaine cartels in the world. At the same time, while President Bukele has managed to take over most state institutions in his country, that is not the case in Ecuador either. And as you mentioned, that was not even Noboa's intention. He hasn't moved towards trying to take over political institutions in order to advance his political agenda or his anti-crime war. Noboa's decision have been challenged by independent courts and especially by the Constitutional Court, which have dismissed some of the initiatives that President Noboa has put forward to deal with the crime situation or the security situation. The same has happened with Congress, where President Noboa lacks a majority and now has a Congress in opposition. President Noboa cannot do as he pleases.
You referenced, Sebastián, the fact that President Noboa does not have absolute power. He doesn't have anything close to that. Ecuador is a country that at times has seemed ungovernable over the years. So many different groups, so many divisions. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the opposition has been doing? And particularly, you referenced earlier in the interview the Correistas, the supporters of former President Rafael Correa. He, back in January, was actually supporting what President Noboa was doing. I know that that's changed in the months since, but how hard are they pushing back against Noboa right now?
It's been an interesting period. President Noboa managed to build a supportive political majority in Congress during the first months of his administration. And actually, President Noboa managed to pass through Congress several legislative initiatives and reforms, especially on the tax front, that would have been unthinkable just a few months back or during the last administration. Most of it had to do with the fact that the Noboa administration was a new government. He presented himself as a political outsider that wasn't necessarily in opposition to Correísmo, wasn't Correísta or anti-Correísta, I would say, and was focused on dealing with the security crisis, something that had the support of most political forces. So he had a pretty good working relationship with most political forces in Congress during the first part of his government. However, in recent months, once he managed to advance his legislative agenda and he didn't have any more interest on having a working relationship with Congress, he started facing off with political forces in Congress, especially with Correistas. And the arrest, as I mentioned before, the arrest of Vice President Glass was a major event that soured the relationship with the Correismo. And after that, he has been very aggressive in confronting Correismo and accusing Correismo of being part or being supportive of the criminal organizations that Ecuador is in war against. And that has placed Correismo in a direct confrontation with the government. And the Correista bloc in Congress has been, since then, very actively opposing any government initiative. But President Noboa hasn't stopped there. He has basically attacked most political organizations in Congress and have come in direct confrontation with them, even with right wing political organizations in Congress, including the Social Christian Party, which was expected to be an ally for the government. I think what President Noboa is doing is basically positioning himself for next year presidential election and positioning himself as still the outsider of the next election, like the new guy who's confronting the traditional political forces of Ecuador. He's been calling all these opposition forces as the old Ecuador, working with all political ways.
What have we learned about Daniel Noboa over the last 6 months? I mean, I ask this because he did present himself as an outsider when he won the election for this somewhat untraditional, truncated term of a year and a half. He's 36 years old now. He comes from this very wealthy family, but we didn't know much about him. And one of the questions that came up when this all happened in January was, essentially, gosh, how is this guy going to react? Is he up to this kind of challenge that would test the abilities and political skills of anybody? What's your, just on a personal level, what have we learned about Noboa over the last 6 months?
Well, the Noboa government is very unusual. It's a very unusual government for many reasons. One is the fact that it's basically a temporary government. As you mentioned, he's very young. I think he's unexperienced on the political realm and he's unexperienced on public policy. And I think he and his government have been improvising a lot during their administration. You can tell that from the choices he has made in terms of appointing government officials with no clear experience on the areas they're supposed to lead, from the fact that he has gone back and forth with policy decisions that also look very improvised. So I think this is a guy who's learning as he goes.
I was surprised by, and it wasn't the most important thing, but this interview that he gave to the New Yorker and John Lee Anderson, where he said these things about, I mean, he didn't spare anybody. He said of Javier Milei, I don't know why he thinks he's so great. He hasn't done anything since he became president. He seems full of himself, which is actually very Argentine. His words, by the way, not mine. He was critical of Gabriel Boric. He called Nayib Bukele arrogant.
President Noboa hasn't had experience with media throughout his life. You know, he entered public life probably a year and a half before he was elected congressman in the last Congress. And that's the first time that he was basically under the scrutiny of media. And it was the first time that he started dealing with media, and mostly Ecuadorian media. International media, he attracted international media attention only once he was elected president. And I think that lack of experience for sure has to do with this.
We'll be back after a short break. The Americas Society Art Gallery in New York City is a spectacular place to see art from Latin America. The gallery is currently showing the city's first ever solo exhibition of the Argentine artist Alejandra Sever. The show features the artist's colorful abstract work, which includes, believe it or not, a mini golf course for visitors to play while looking at the works. The exhibit is on view only until July 27th, 2024, so hurry up and get here. The Americas Society Art Gallery is at 680 Park Avenue in New York. I want to talk just a little bit more about the economy. You mentioned this earlier. It's, by some measures, the worst performing major economy in Latin America right now. Noboa's policy started out with a lot of energy, though. He managed to push through a tax reform, struck a $4 billion loan agreement with the International Monetary Fund. What's the rest of the year? What's the outlook look like? What are the challenges that are facing him now from a policy perspective?
I think those two moves have helped in stabilizing the Ecuadorian economy that was facing significant fiscal and balance of payment challenges. But I think, as I said, those moves have only stabilized or have only served to stabilize the Ecuadorian economy. None of those reforms will promote significant growth going forward. For Ecuador to create the conditions for significant growth to return require really major economic reforms that I don't think are part of the Noboa political agenda, at least until he gets reelected next year.
Let me try, as we wrap things up here, Sebastián, to synthesize our conversation a bit. What I'm hearing from you is we have a president in Daniel Noboa who remains fairly popular by regional standards, still has the support of about half of Ecuadorian society. It's down a bit, but he's still doing okay. His security crackdown has produced some results. It's not clear how strong they are, but the country is certainly not paralyzed in the way that it was back in January. But he faces all these challenges from a political class, including the opposition, that is increasingly against him, less inclined to rally around the flag in the way they were back in January. He also, let's be honest, faces extremely powerful opponents in these criminal gangs that include groups, Mexican cartels, Colombian groups as well, that have just vast amounts of money and resources at their disposal. And then, as we just discussed, an economy that has been flat or worse for the better part of 5 years. What he's been doing policy-wise could be classified as trying to put the house in order, which is necessary but isn't going to get you back to growth. If you add all this up, is he still the favorite for next year's election, or is this a wide open race? I think it's a tough question everywhere, but maybe in Ecuador specifically.
Yeah, we're still a few months away from the first round election in Ecuador, the first round presidential election in Ecuador, which will take place early February 2025. So a lot can happen during that time. However, right now, I think President Noboa is still well positioned to win re-election. And that's due to a couple of reasons. Yeah, he's had a very short period of time, so it is an unusual presidency. The other factor is, he still remains relatively popular, as we discussed before, with approval ratings above 50%. And also the fact that you have a very fragmented opposition and very divided opposition, and you don't have any other attractive figures, I would say, in the opposition forces. So the fact that you have this still popular president, which has support, the fact that you don't have any other major political figures participating in the election, the fact that you have a Correista political group that has been hit by a lot of political scandals in recent months, that have their major figures either out of the country, and you have Vice President Glass in prison. And I think if you combine all those factors, and especially due to the fact that President Noboa still, I think, remains like the new face, the outsider of the upcoming election, in a context where there's general frustration with what has happened before, general frustration with what's going on right now, I think he still has the upper hand to win in the next year's election. However, as you can tell, that re-election bid is highly dependent on at least two immediate key factors. It is highly dependent on Noboa delivering on the security front. Ecuadorians need to see at least marginal improvements in the security situation. And those improvements need to be maintained up until the day of the election. The other factor is, as I mentioned, we faced already significant energy blackouts back in April. And the energy situation in Ecuador remains very challenging for several reasons. If President Noboa cannot deliver on improvements in the security situation, and we face significant energy blackouts in the next few months, that's going to generate significant frustration and will sour voter sentiment in favor of President Noboa. And also, less significant, but still significant, on how he presents Ecuador with a plan for the future, especially on the economy, on how he plans to promote growth again in the economy, and if those plans are credible.
It's a country that faces so many challenges. Sebastián, I want to thank you for giving us such a measured overview of all of them today. And thank you for joining us once again on the America's Quarterly Podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.